part? Set? Okay. Bill Curwood, as you know, he talks funny. He wasn't born around here in central Kentucky. He was born in Oamaru, New Zealand, 2 years before my father, 1934. Married Linda in 1976. At that point, Linda was the minister of Christian education at Lafayette Christian Church. I just heard Bill saying that 40 years ago he began his ministry out at North Middletown, and they're going out tomorrow to worship with that congregation in celebration of Bill's ministry and beginning there those many years ago. He was ordained in 1965 by the New Zealand Associated Churches of Christ. He graduated from the Glenleith Bible College and the University of, is it Otago, Bill? That's right. Otago, with his Bachelor of Arts in 1972. Came to UK and got his clinical pastoral education in 1974 and got his Doctor of Ministry at LTS, Lexington Theological Seminary, in 1975. I was interested to see that for 9 years, Bill was an accountant. And then from 1965 on, serving churches in New Zealand, and then in the United States, North Middletown, and then up at Fort Thomas, Kentucky as senior minister, and then out at Sedalia, Missouri as the senior minister from 1989 to 2000. And as so many ministers are unable to do, Bill could not retire and just stay put. He's done numerous interim ministries. I'm counting 6 interim ministries across Kentucky and including Huntsville, Alabama, and most recently at the Nicholasville Christian Church. All kinds of community service, as you might imagine, that Bill has been involved in, and honors and awards that I'll not go through here because I just want to invite Bill up here to share his story. So great to have so many here. So let's welcome Bill Curwood.
Good day, you all. If I was a politician, I would be able to use my hour and a half telling you how wonderful I am and how stupid everybody else is. I'm not going to do that. Or I could be like the fellow advertising Dairy Queen sandwiches, hot and dusty and dry or something. What a magnificent meal. Thank you, cooks. Thank you. I'm going to speak for just a few moments about my country so that you may have an understanding of who Bill Curwood is and what my history means to me. New Zealand was the last found by Europeans landmass. It was an empty country. It became part of the British Commonwealth Empire in 1840. There were no mammals on the land whatsoever. No wild animals, no bears, no cats, no monkeys, no squirrels, no skunks. Just a free, beautiful, open country. New Zealand was the first country in the world for national suffrage. Women gained the vote in New Zealand in 1893, slightly before America. First country in the world to have a woman Episcopal bishop. New Zealand climbed the top of the world, Sir Edmund Hillary on Everest. New Zealand was the first country to fly heavier than air machines before the Wright brothers. Richard Pearse, who lived very close to my home, had flown before Richard Pearse, and of course the French were in there too, trying to get off the ground. I think they're still trying to get off the ground. It was a New Zealander whose mathematics made the atomic age come true. Einstein with physics, and the Baron Ernest Rutherford of Nelson, New Zealand, was the mathematician. A New Zealander, John Pickering, headed the American space program for 20 years. That was a new one to me. Sylvia Warner found a new way of teaching reading, and New Zealand was the most literate country in the world. New Zealand's Sir Truby King founded an organisation called the Plunkett Society, named after the Queen's Governor of New Zealand, for the care of women and children. It's been the model for America and most countries around the world, and our child mortality rate is very, very low to this day. New Zealand, behind Sweden, was the first country in the world to have socialised medicine, social security, pensions for widows and for orphans, and if someone was incarcerated, their family was not financially incarcerated because there was a prisoner's widow's pension to go along, to keep them going. New Zealand banished the death penalty 50 years ago, and I was part of a little committee that worked on that. Do you know how many people in Kentucky have won Olympic medals at the Olympic Games? Can you think of any Kentuckians? New Zealand, with a population about the same as Kentucky's, had in 2068 medals at the Olympics. And since then, we've had at least another dozen. So in round figures, New Zealand has 80 Olympic medals. It's pretty good, isn't it? The first was a fellow called Jack Lovelock, who won the 1,500 metres, what we call the mile, but the 1,500 metres, in 1936 in Berlin. Adolf Hitler didn't have a good time at the Olympic Games in 1936. Jesse Owens stole all the short distance, and the New Zealander won the mile. There wasn't much left for the distinguished Aryan race. I don't think he was very pleased about that. Well, one other thing about New Zealand: you are not allowed to own a small firearm in New Zealand. There's no need for them. We don't need to shoot wild animals. We don't need to shoot Indians. No one in New Zealand is allowed a small firearm. You can have hunting rifles, but there's not much to hunt. A few rabbits and some deer that have been introduced. But it's a very free and safe country. Our mortality rate through murders is absolutely a point of a fraction. And I know when I say that, a lot of people say, oh, that's terrible, that goes against the Second Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and so forth. But that's my country. That's the metrics of my belief. And I'm glad to say that, because I was in the military, I served in the military, got run over by an army truck, and that finished my military career. But I know how to shoot I know how to shoot a fast gun, Bren gun and Sten gun, and not the 49s or 47s, which are now on the market, so easily gained. But that's something for me to think about, because I'm very proud to be a New Zealander. Now, I grew up in Oamaru, a small coastal town. My parents, Anna and Alfred Curwood, raised 4 sons. My older brother by 1 year, Ron, and then just 14 months later, John, my twin, and myself were in the middle, and then 8 years after that, our young brother. My maternal great-grandparents, Walter and Mary Hope, founded my home church from the British Churches of Christ, but we regard ourselves as disciples of Christ. My family founding name is Hope, and hope has been the basis of my own theological persuasion since I could understand what hope really meant. My father was raised in the Church of England tradition, and grandfather Curwood was a very staunch Anglican. He didn't like my mother because she was chapel, she was C of Church of Christ, but my mother and father were married in the Church of Christ by Sir Garfield Todd, a New Zealand missionary to Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, and knighted for his efforts, and imprisoned also for his efforts on behalf of black people. While I'm speaking of black people, at my second year at college at Glenleith, I roomed with a Zulu, a Matabele tribesman by the name of Shadrach Gumbo. Great fellow, taught me so much. Back to grandfather Curwood, he did not like my twin and myself. He had no time for us, he loved my older brother. He could go into the granddad's workshop, but you other vermin, you keep out of there. It was tough, it was hard. But, and he wasn't kind to my mother, and we became homeless. We became homeless as a family and had to park in with our grandparents. It was not a happy experience, one of the most unhappy experiences of my life. But even from bad things, good things happen. My mother became very seriously ill during the pregnancy of my younger brother. we thought she was going to die, and the doctor said that there wasn't hope for her. But the family gathered, and I remember the family gathering at my home, and I remember going into my bedroom. There was a big blue square carpet in the middle of the floor, and I knelt down on my knees and I prayed to God that my mother wouldn't die. And I can still feel the tears searing into my skin and into my life. Prayed that my mother would not die. She had some trauma. Something burst in her stomach, and it was a cyst or growth or something. But they were able to drain it, and she lived to be 92 years old. And is it a miracle? Well, is it just an act of happenstance? Well, you can choose your own way of life, but it was truly a wonder, something beyond all of our expectations, and for that I thank God. It changed Mother's life and it changed ours. Now, my little brother was 2 months old when she had all the surgery. And the Salvation Army lady came to our house and she said to my father, "Mr. Curwood, your wife is very sick in hospital." And they'd taken the little brother into hospital too because he wasn't even weaned. And she said, "He's not being very well looked after. I will take him for 6 weeks." And she took my little brother for 12. And he's now the head of the family, and we all love him very dearly. But it gave me a great love for the Salvation Army. I had a great honour and love and respect for my old Sunday school teacher, George Wilson, who's was a Brother Davis that David spoke about in one of your churches. Mine was George Wilson. Every time I went up a grade in Sunday school, guess what? So did Brother George. He was the only Sunday school teacher I had for 6 or 8 years. It was a small thing. Now, Brother George was the treasurer of the Sunday school, and some of those of us who were younger, we wanted to paint some of the Sunday school classrooms, and Brother George said, "No, we don't have enough money." And we outvoted him. Just, teenagers, and we outvoted him. Come Saturday morning, we were going to start on painting, and guess who was there first? Brother George. He said, "It's not about me, it's not my opinion, it's we. It's we." And that's one of the dynamics that has helped me get through all of my life in ministry. It does not matter what I think or what I want, it's we, because we are the community of Christ. We're disciples together. I learned that lesson from Brother George, surreptitiously, I guess. But in my teenager years, I wasn't sure that I wanted to continue with this Christian business and the church, because our church was so small. And my twin and I were walking home from something downtown, about a mile from our house. We were talking about this. We talked a lot, you see. Twins do that sort of thing. And we decided together that we'd hang in until something better came along. And about 70 years later, 68 years later, we're still hanging in. We're still waiting for something better to come along. And I presume to continue the journey. In my home church, read prayers were anathema to some of the oldies. Had to learn to pray extemporaneously. And we were well taught, I guess. John and I would go to old Brother George and Martha's house to go through the Sunday school lessons because we were trying to be teachers. And it was time to go. And we'd say, "Oh, it's time, we must get on home." Brother George says, "All right, but before we go, we'll have prayer. And you begin." Yeah. And that's how I learned to pray at old Brother George and Martha's house. I worked for the firm of J. Rattray and Sons for 10 years. Started as the boy in the store, went into the office, and the last 2 years I was the company accountant. I'm not a CPA, and I don't propose to be ever. But in working for Rattray's, I found a place of good hard work. They were tea merchants. They treated me well. But after 2 years as being accountant, I felt this was a pretty good place. The chair felt pretty good in the corner office, in charge of the staff, but it just pallowed away, just like sand. And I decided that I just had to go and study for ministry. Now, I had a problem. I had 2 or 3 problems that stood in the way. I was a school dropout from Waitaki Boys High School in the 2nd year of high school. So I had no high school education, no higher high school education, and I was sadly lacking in the classics and in English, how to speak properly. And I had a terrible lisp, in which I had to try and overcome throughout all of my ministry. As well as that, I'm pretty well tone deaf. Have you ever heard of a preacher who can't sing? I mean, really can't sing? I had a terrible experience out at Sedalia, Missouri. They left the speakers on while I was doing that. Linda was preaching at a little country church that she shared ministry in, 4 of them doing that. I'm doing the same thing now at Carlisle. And I hoped that, guess what happened this morning? There was something awful happened at church. Dad sang over the loudspeaker. Anyway, Waitaki was a fairly hard school, run like a military academy, but I got through 2 years of high school, left, went to Rattries. When I left Rattries, they replaced me with 2 people. And I thought, well, that was stupid of me, because I could have done a lot of other things than work so hard for J. Rattray and Son and worked overtime on my own. Anyway, I was accepted at Glenleith Bible College. The principal during most of my time was a cousin of Wayne Bell's, a man called Gavin Munro, who was a very great fellow. He had succeeded Dr. Hatton, who was giving a radio broadcast service and dropped dead. That certainly stirred up the congregation that day. I didn't, and talk about New Zealand, one thing I didn't add was that Wayne Bell's father was from New Zealand. So I like to sit at the same table as Wayne and get some reflected or deflected glory. But after Glenleith, and we also did studies. I did 6 years academic studies in 4 because I took 2 different degrees from 2 different colleges at the same time. The University of Otago, part of the University of New Zealand, and Glenleith, our own Bible college. But I had to work too hard there too, and I think that was a mistake in retrospect. We also took studies at Knox Theological College. Lloyd Gehring was the principal, and Lloyd Gehring was involved in the God is Dead theology at that time, which some of the pastors may recall. John Robinson, an Anglican bishop, an Anglican bishop. He was in the God is Dead business, and fellow Clark wrote For Christ's Sake, which was writing on the fact that Jesus Christ was still alive. But they were very interesting times to be a theological student in New Zealand. I remember my first day at Glenleith. We gathered in the lecture hall, and the principal, that was A.L. Haddon at the time, the one who was to drop dead a little later, said, he told us which church we would go to, and we were only allowed to stay 1 year. That's all the damage we were allowed to do. And he went through the names. Mr. Vickery here, Mr. Tucker there, Mr. Ruby there, Mr. Wright there. There was only 1 church and 1 name left. And Mr. Curwood, you will go to Mornington. Oh God, please, oh God, not Mornington. And I lasted there my whole year. The student before me there had been transferred halfway through. 22 people at worship regularly. 7 of them were preachers. I preached every other morning and every night at that congregation. And my 4th year, they asked for me to come back, which was unusual unusual for them and unusual for me, I guess. But it was a good time. My third church was at Gorma Tower. They had a pastor and 2 preaching places, and I alternated in the morning and then shared the evening service. I went into the little room at the little vestry room, we called it, and there was a little desk I used there, and there was an envelope with my name on it. It had my name on it and some money in it, but I don't know who gave it to me. And you know, giving money anonymous like that creates a great problem. You don't know who to be thankful to. So I had to be thankful to everyone. And I found that a very good model for Christian stewardship and for the joy of giving. I want to go on a little bit. I wrote some notes because if I didn't, I'd stay you the full hour and a half, and I know you can't do that. When I worked at a freezing works in my college years, I worked at a freezing works. 12,000 lambs were killed a day. Big place. I worked on the main floor in small goods. I won't tell you what I did. We just had breakfast. But on the mezzanine floor, there were about 12 fellows who did a lot of blade work with liver and kidneys. And one of the chutes broke down. They couldn't continue there. The boss never let people with knives just hang around, sit around. So he put them around the rest of the tables. And there was one fellow who worked up there. It was a real hard case. You could always hear his bawdy stories coming across for everyone to hear. And the fellow he enjoyed speaking with the most was a fellow called Bob, who was an Episcopal student. And this fellow came to my table, and we were working away, and he said to me, "So you think you're going to be a minister?" And I said, "Yes, that's what I'm training for." He said, "Oh, Bob up there, he's studying for the Episcopal ministry. He's such a great guy. But I wouldn't like him to be my minister." I got a lesson that day. Keep your hands clean and keep your lips clean as well. Keep your mind clean. Great piece of advice from a fellow who didn't realize what a philosopher he was. Now, when I decided to come to America, Dr. Wayne Bell was just about to come to LTS. Dr. Robert Preston was my senior professor in pastoral care, an absolutely wonderful fellow. He didn't write anything, unfortunately. Dr. Ron Graham, an Aussie. Don't hold that against him. He was a very nice fellow, even if he was from Australia. And Dr. Vic Fowler, and Ruth Kitchen, who sits upstairs. Do anyone here know who Ruth Kitchen is? Oh, yes. She and I started a correspondence. And we wrote letters back and forth until my time to come to America. And she was so helpful. To this day, I just honor and love Ruth for the work that she did on behalf of the seminary and for my sake. Time's getting on, my hour and a half is almost up, but I want to talk about my 3 churches just for a moment. First, at North Middletown, I think it was a marriage made in heaven. But you know, there's a real problem when a church calls a minister. The minister is usually coming from some other place where people loved him or her. And here he's starting all over again. And with ministry, you get married, and then you fall in love. That's the relationship of a minister and a congregation. Am I right, David?
Yes.
Right. Yes. We're called as strangers to one another. We get married and we live happily as long as we possibly can. And that was a wonderful, wonderful ministry for me at North Middletown. 40 years ago tomorrow, I had my first service there. 19 hours up top to get here, absolutely blown away with the jet lag and time lag and all that. Hoke Dickinson, who was formerly the curator of Cambridge Meeting House, some of you may remember Hoke Dickinson, he was from Georgia. Georgia, that's down east somewhere. I couldn't understand a word Hope Dickinson was saying. Hope Dickinson couldn't understand a word I was saying. And the congregation couldn't understand either of us. It was a wonderful, wonderful time there. Linda was quite ill. Our daughter was born, and as one lady said, the whole congregation was pregnant with Anna Hope. They blessed and nurtured Linda and myself through some difficult decisions, and then in her coming, which just is so absolutely wonderful. Guy Waldrop was one of our first friends in America, and he was so helpful. Linda still talks of Guy like she talked to her brother. She gives him a hard time, harder than anybody I know. We went to northern Kentucky to Fort Thomas, and that was a growing church, and so that was a growing experience for us. We needed to move from North Middletown to Fort Thomas because the interest rates had gone out of sight, 15, 18, 20%. We knew if ever we were going to own our own home, we had to start. So we moved to a church that gave us a housing allowance, and so we were able to put that down as a deposit and gradually get our own home when we came into retirement. Preachers don't get the highest salaries, but I think sometimes we get the highest pay through the love and the goodwill that is ours. Only the doctor, some of you are here today, only the doctor and the pastor has almost by dint of right the privilege of knocking on the door and opening the door and going into someone's home. And it's a privilege to be guarded and respected and honoured. To be a pastor is to be the greatest calling, I really believe. I'd love to have been a doctor. I really would have loved to have been a medical doctor. I didn't have the intelligence for that. I haven't got this long memory. And that's why I'm so glad to see my friend Jeff here this morning. Because when I came, you were heading out on some of those missionary journeys into Central America. Dee Dee with you to do pacemakers and so forth, as many as you could in the shortest time possible. And I admire that sort of toil and commitment to Christ and to the well-being of other people. And he's sitting beside Jim. Jim put me back together again when I had a stupid accident. So, a silly accident, and broke my ankle, and he looked at it. He didn't think it was worth much, but he'd give it a go. And he put me back together again, so every time I see Jim around, he's not only a friend and mentor, but he's one person who has done so much for me. I concluded my 12 years of ministry at Sedalia with a great sense of thanksgiving. The church had grown considerably. A church about this size. And last year we had a fire in the sanctuary, and that was a great pressure on everyone. But I loved the people there, and I got involved in Habitat for Humanity, as I had at North Middletown and Fort Thomas, and many other organisations, Child Safe, which tried to protect children when they had to be examined, forensically examined. And then it was time to retire. Old preachers don't ever retire. They just keep on going. I think it's Bill Purcell said he was a failure at retirement. He'd retired 7 times. And I'm about the same. But I only ever wanted to be a pastor. That's all I ever wanted to be, was a pastor. I didn't aspire to get into national office and regional office stuff, although I worked as best I could, and I loved camping. But I want to conclude, finally. Isn't that a wonderful word when someone's speaking? Finally. It's a good word, isn't it? Finally. We have ended up at Central Christian Church in Lexington, Kentucky. And we have grown and grown and grown in our love for this congregation. We really have. And I think sometimes we forget what a wonderful congregation Central Christian Church truly is. I look around, all of you have stories much more magnificent than mine. But I came here the first Sunday sat in the pew, and guess who served communion to Bill and Linda Curwood? Pam, the mayor. The mayor of the city served us communion. And someone who is the leader in the church is a servant. And I've seen all the wonderful ministries we do, from St. James Place to the children's care, to the children's ministry, which your wife is so much involved with, to Jeff and Didi with their missionary efforts, Spirit of Witness, the spirit of Bill Embry. His spirit is the spirit of Central Christian Church. When we first came to the church, we were new. We really didn't know many people. We'd been away from Lexington for such a long time. Tom Radden had been at the church at Lafayette, where Linda was Minister of Christian Education, and he said, I want you to come to our Sunday school class. And I've been there ever since. Linda goes on to the Bible class, Bible study class, but I'd had a lot of that in seminary, and I thought I wanted more of a forum type. But I love Central Christian Church, with their fine, reverent worship, with their beautiful choir and organ music. You see, you get older and you change your attitude. I'm past the yappy, clappy stuff. I've left that behind. Now I want something that's got some depth to it, and some grace to it, and I hope some future to it. Because my preacher, Keith Andrews, said on one occasion in a sermon, the older God gets, the better he gets. One of the elders came out of his pew at the end of the service. Woo! But it's true. The longer we journey with God, the deeper we give ourselves to God, the better God gets. It's a great honor and a great privilege just to share a little bits of my story. Thank you.
Amen.